Hi, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, The Fundamentals of Successful Negotiations. My name is Shannon Tim, and I'm the Director of Alumni Relations at the Wisconsin School of Business. This webinar is part of an ongoing series that we host for WSB alumni, so we're happy that you're joining us today. We will be recording today's session and providing a link to that recording in our follow-up communications. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to share some other things that you might be interested in. So first and foremost, homecoming is right around the corner, and we're excited to be resuming the homecoming bash at Granger Hall before the Badgers take on Iowa next weekend on October 30th. We also have our next Badger Executive Talk on November 10th. This is part of a series where Dean Samba invites executives from our alumni community to have candid conversations about leadership and present day challenges. He will be speaking with Laura Francis, who is CEO of SI Bone, a medical device company which focuses on back pain. Then in December, we'll be hosting a panel about thriving in retirement, where 3 members from our alumni community will be sharing their experiences at this stage in their life. And finally, we will be hosting the Business of Cheese, everyone's favorite, on December 14th, where you can hear from alumni working in this industry. If you would like more information about any of these opportunities, you can find it at business.wisc.edu/alumni. We will be taking questions at the end of today's presentation, and so you can submit your questions at any time in the Q&A box, and we'll leave time at the end to have our speaker respond. You can see a visual on the screen right now that shows you where to find that Q&A box, so that circled area at the bottom of your screen. And with that, I'm going to get into introducing today's speaker. So we are fortunate to have Charlie Trevor with us today, who is a professor in the Department of Management and Human Resources at the Wisconsin School of Business. He holds the Ruth L. Nelson Chair in Business, and he is the academic director of the Strategic Human Resource Management Center. His research focuses on employee turnover, layoff effects on human capital, and the determinants and consequences of employee compensation. Charlie teaches courses on negotiations, employee compensation, research methods, and HR systems. So he's definitely the expert, and we're glad to have him with us today. So Charlie, thank you so much for being here. I'm going to turn it over to you at this point, but I will rejoin you at the end for the Q&A portion. So take it away.
Great, thanks, Shannon. Let's see, I think I have control here. Yeah, okay. So arguably I have control. There I go. Thanks for having me today, and thank you all for showing up. My webinar today is going to be about successfully negotiating, and it's a topic I feel very strongly about, particularly in business school education. I've been teaching it here for over a decade, and I think it provides a lot of value to our students. So I feel fortunate to be able to do it, and I'm glad that you're here today to talk about it for an hour or so. So with that, I have a lot of information for you, so let's just dive right in. My goals here today are fourfold. First, I'd like to give you some of the basics, some of the fundamentals, so that we can have a more informed conversation. Then I'll give you some applied tactics, some behavioral things that you can take with you. That'll lead into a little bit more of a nuanced approach to negotiation. We'll get at something called the negotiator's dilemma, which may evoke memories from your days studying economics, and the prisoner's dilemma, and that's for good reason. So we'll talk about this underlying tension in negotiations of, should I compete or should I cooperate? And then I'll wind up with a short introduction to a more sophisticated approach to negotiations called integrative bargaining, where maybe we can get to that idealistic but sometimes attainable win-win kind of outcome, where we actually create value and make the pie bigger. But we got to walk before we run. So let's talk about some foundational aspects. Here's a definition for you. Interactive process takes place when we want something from somebody or they want something from us. That sounds very general, and that's by design. Negotiations isn't just union sitting across from management, or you trying to leverage some well-deserved extra dollars out of your boss. It's a very general process, and we teach the courses that way. And the notion is that we negotiate pretty much all the time. We negotiate at work, we negotiate at home, we negotiate with acquaintances, we meet in our day-to-day activities. So this kind of interpersonal interplay goes on all the time. And thus there's great value in just learning how to do it a little better. And that's what today is all about, getting us started on that road. So let me give you an example that we can just sort of use for some context. So I'm not just speaking in abstract about some of these negotiation mechanics as we lay out some of the underlying principles. So let's say that you are running a manufacturing firm and need a plant. So you don't have time to build, you need to buy one. You have access to potentially 2 suitable locations. One's in Middleton, one's in Monona. I hope you remember from your glorious Madison days that Middleton and Monona sit contiguous, one on the west side and one on the east side. They're adjacent and contiguous with Madison. And you can get the Middleton plant for $25 million. Now you're gonna see about talking to Monona. Okay, so you need a plant, you can get Middleton for $25 million. Now you're gonna sit down with Monona. That's our context here. So one question we might want to ask is, does it make sense to even talk to Monona? Is there a deal to be made there? And this brings up one of our the first key kind of term I want you to know, called a zone of agreement. It depends on if there's a zone of agreement, which is a place for a rational deal to even happen. In other words, does it make sense for us to talk to Monona? Is it even viable? Let me give you an example where it's not viable. Say that you've got $150,000 to spend and you're interested in buying my $300,000 house. Well, there's probably not a space for a rational deal from both perspectives there. There's probably no zone of agreement. But if we have reason to think there might be one, then it's worth sitting down. So to better understand this zone of agreement, this place for rational deals, there's a concept called reservation price. And many of you probably have an intuitive sense of this or know the term already. That's the minimum acceptable deal to you. In other words, sort of the worst deal you'd take. Synonyms are your bottom line or your walkaway point. So maybe getting out of school here at Madison, you've decided you needed $45,000 to live. And so accepting a job for 40 wouldn't make any sense. You've done the math, you've drawn the line in the sand, and 45,000 is your reservation price. Same fundamental here. Okay, so let's think about reservation prices and the zone of agreement in our context. And one question we ask is, do the reservation prices for each side allow both sides to say yes? And if so, that's what would convince us that we have this zone of agreement, this place where it's rational to make a deal. So the way I described it to you, your reservation price would be $25 million. You can get Middleton for $25 million. So it wouldn't make any sense to buy Monona for 26, but it would make very good rational sense to buy Monona for 24 or 23 or less. Okay, let's say Monona has a reservation price of $20 million. They have another offer on their plant. You probably don't know about it because unfortunately we don't tend to have perfect information. If we did, it'd make all this a lot easier. But let's say that they have another offer for $20 million. That would be their reservation price. It would make no rational sense for Monona to sell to you for 19, but it would make very much rational sense to sell to you for 21 or 22 million. So we have this area between 20 and 25 million where both sides could benefit from making a deal. Both sides would say, yeah, that's better than no deal. Whether it's 21 or 22, 23, 24. Now, obviously there's an array there of possible deals. It's called the zone of agreement. It's a window. And where we fall in that window depends on some of the strategies and tactics we'll talk about today, and some things we'll move into in the next few minutes. But what I want to get across is this notion that there can be a zone of agreement where there's an overlap between what the buyer will pay and what the seller will accept. And that's a place where we can strike rational deals. Now, another term that I need you to know as we move forward and talk about this, how do I know what my reservation price is? There's something called a BATNA, which is a fundamental term in negotiations, acronym for best alternative to a negotiated agreement. So this is what happens if there's no deal. What's my next step? Where do I go if we walk away from each other? We just can't come to a meeting of the minds. What's next? Okay. So in this case, if I can't get a deal with Monona, it means that I'm going to spend 25 million to buy Middleton. We've already figured out we can do that. I need a plant. I can get Middleton for 25. That's reasonable to me. So that's my BATNA. That's my best alternative. That's what happens if I can't make a deal with Monona. Okay. So if you can buy Monona for less than that, if you can buy Monona for 24 million, it makes good rational sense to do so. So you think about your BATNA frequently determines your reservation price. It frequently determines where you draw that line in the sand. What happens if I can't get a deal? Okay. And so we're going to assume for argument's sake that Monona wants to sell and has another offer that you don't know about for 20 million. That's its BATNA. If you and Monona can't come to an agreement, they're going to sell for 20 and you're going to buy Middleton for 25. So we know our BATNAs and those have driven our reservation prices. So let's look at it graphically again. Okay, you have your reservation price of 25 million. That's what you can get Middleton for. Monona has their reservation price of 20 million. That's what their other offers for. Okay, so we have this area in which it's better for us to make a deal than to go to our BATNA. It's better for me to make a deal for 24 or 23 or 21 with Monona, and it's better for them to make a deal in there too. This zone of agreement where it makes sense for us to make deals. It's a function of our reservation prices for both sides, and those things come from our BATNAs. Okay. Rational deals can be struck for both. So, and then the next question is, okay, well, that's kind of a foundation, but what about things like first offers and targets? Well, they fit into this. I'm going to show you graphically as well, because I think that's an easier way to kind of understand it. And then we'll talk about the strategic implications, but just to kind of get the mechanics down, and this is not going to be shocking to you. Typically, your first offer is going to be a better deal than your target, and that's going to be a better deal than your reservation price. So if I can buy Middleton for 25, well, maybe my target, maybe I think, yeah, I bet I can get Monona for 21. Maybe that's optimistic, but maybe doable based on some other things I know. I've done my homework, and that's going to be the underlying theme here also in negotiations. Prepare, do your homework. It's not just winging it. So if I'm thinking maybe I can get it for 21, maybe I make a first offer of 18, because negotiations is a dance. It's about making concessions and reacting to the other's concessions. So you'd want to have a reasonably optimistic or aggressive first offer that allows you to backtrack toward your target. If need be, backtracking toward your reservation price, but never backtracking beyond your reservation price. You've done the math. You've drawn the line in the sand for a reason. Okay, similarly, your seller's going to have the exact same kind of fundamentals in play. They have a reservation price for 20 million in Monona. Maybe they think, I think Charlie's got a lot of money. Maybe we can get it from 28 from him, given what I've seen in his past dealings. So maybe we'll open up and try to make a first offer even more aggressive to allow us to backtrack toward that $28 million target. Targets are really important. If you focus on your target, you're more likely to be near it. If you focus on your reservation price, you're more likely to be near there. We'll talk about goal setting and targets in a few minutes. Okay, another basic concept you need to know, standards. Where am I getting these numbers? Just pulling numbers out and throwing out 28 million or whatever. We tend to get these numbers that we're dealing with from something called standards. Some of the numbers are going to come from the strategy, the expertise that you deploy when you're sitting down with your counterpart. But sometimes they're going to come from standards, which are objective or legitimate sort of signposts where fair deals could be struck. Think about in law, the standard is precedence. There's been a case like this already. This is what the judge has decided. Okay, that's a standard that we would build on. We can think about standards in other areas. Think about appraisal values for houses. Those are standards we can draw upon. Comparable, what other houses have sold for when we're setting our price. If you're trying to get a better deal in terms of salary, well, what's the market data tell us for people with your qualifications, or what were you earning at your last firm? These are standards, arguably legitimate indicators of what a fair outcome would be. They're really important in negotiations. So negotiations often are sort of bounded by these reservation prices, and then within that, standards can help kind of narrow the discussion. Okay, so summary, just of these key kind of principles laying the foundation. There's a BATNA, best alternative to a negotiated agreement. That's what happens if you can't make a deal. That frequently drives your reservation price, where you draw the line in the sand before going into a negotiation. So you know when you have to walk away and don't just get caught up in emotion and do something that you'll regret later. The two reservation prices, if there's overlap between what the buyer will spend and what the seller will accept, we create this zone of agreement, this place where rational deals can be struck. Standards or legitimate indicators of fair deals can kind of narrow that zone and show us where we might come to an agreement. First offers, that first number that gets sent out there by each side, those are important things. We're going to talk about those with applied tactics in a minute. And then I haven't used the term leverage yet, but it's the term virtually everybody knows when you're talking about negotiations. You can think about it as sort of the power to get a good deal, or who needs the deal less. Generally, if you really, really need a deal to happen, you don't tend to have quite as much leverage or power to get the deal done. It's a very complex notion, but kind of a shorthand moving forward. Power to get a good deal is leverage. And that frequently is a function of having a good BATNA too. If you have a really good BATNA, you have more leverage. I'll show you an example in a second here. Let's move on to applied tactics, something you can sort of think about, all right, what would I do? We're in this world called distributive bargaining. As I kind of give you the basics here, some people call it competitive bargaining. You're trying to claim value, and you're often doing it by thinking about aspects of the reservation price. I'm going to focus on that third bullet. Really what you want to do is you want to move your counterpart toward their reservation price and away from yours. You are buying that plant and you're thinking about buying it from Monona. You'd rather move the deal toward their $20 million reservation price and away from your $25 million reservation price. Okay, so you really want to claim value. You want to do better. We think about price. You want to, if you're a buyer, you want the price to be low, sell, or high. You want to move toward the reservation price of your counterpart. And that's what these tactics are for. And it's most easy to talk about it today in a, as I boil down a semester into 45 minutes, in a zero-sum issue where price is kind of the default one we tend to think about. Zero-sum meaning I get a better price, you get a worse price, and vice versa. Now, this is not the only kind of negotiation. And in fact, it's not the one we focus on the most in the class as we move toward more complicated negotiations in life that are multi-issue. And so toward the end of this webinar today, I'm going to talk about a little more nuanced kind of negotiation where we're not so much just focused on claiming value. We're doing some other more intricate things. But let's focus now first on some applied tactics you can use in these kind of competitive negotiations. And it really helps us understand negotiations overall as we move forward toward the more nuanced stuff. One is build a better BATNA. You want to have a better alternative. This gives you more leverage. Let me give you an example. Remember, your BATNA is your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. The stronger your BATNA, the stronger your alternative, the easier it is to walk away and the more leverage you have, the more power to get a better deal. So having a good BATNA is really, really important. So let's say you can get Middleton for 22.5 million instead of 25 million. You've just created a stronger BATNA. You have more leverage with Monona. Let's see how that might play out. So originally I said you could get Middleton for 25. Maybe you've managed to talk Middleton down to 22.5. Okay, now your seller in Monona, remember they've got a $20 million reservation price. So you've improved your BATNA by making a better deal with Middleton, and that changes the game with Monona. You've established more leverage. So instead of having a zone of agreement that goes from 20 million to 25 million with Monona, you've improved your BATNA. So your reservation price is no longer 25, now it's 22.5. Okay, and what does that mean? Well, that means any rational deal you strike with Monona is going to top out at 22.5. There's no reason for you to ever spend more than that. You've strengthened your BATNA, which means you've changed your reservation price and you've strengthened your position with Monona. There's still a lot of room for you and Monona to come to an agreement, but it cannot be as lucrative for Monona as it might have been before. You are going to get a better deal than you would have before. The worst deal you're going to get now is 22.5. The worst deal before was 25 million. So by building a better BATNA, a stronger alternative, it gives you more leverage. It gives you better deal to be had. Think about it. When you came out of Madison, you had your degree, you're negotiating with company A, you've got a better BATNA if you also have an offer from company B. It gives you a better position from which to bargain with company A. So I hope that makes sense. Building a better BATNA is huge. It's not always possible, but if you can, building a better BATNA with one alternative put you in a better stead with the negotiation, the focal one that we're talking about. Okay, another tactic, first offers. Everybody talks about first offers. Some say never make the first offer. Others say, hey, make the first offer. So who's right here? Well, neither or both, depends on the situation. A lot of this is very context dependent. And here it really does. It's a much more nuanced, which is one of the troubles with just Googling things on how do I negotiate it. They don't always have the nuance. So let me walk you through a little of the nuance on first offer. So why might you want to make it? Well, there's a very strong psychological principle called anchoring, and anchoring really works. Nature abhors a vacuum, and we abhor a numerical vacuum as well. And when a first number gets into our brain, it really has a disproportionate impact, and we sort of anchor and adjust from that first number. So that suggests you want that first number to be advantageous for you. You want to get a number out there that we adjust from to anchor the negotiations. Let me give you a couple of really quick examples from the research just to show how strong this is. There's a study where people are asked to envision the last 2 digits of their social security number, and then they're asked to bid on wine and chocolates. Well, these should have nothing to do with each other, right? Well, the people who had higher digits in their social security number actually bid more for wine and chocolates. Just having a number bouncing around affects what we do next. Let's go from a almost silly example to something a little more relevant. Researchers took realtors, people who make their money, they make their living by buying and selling houses or commercial properties. And these realtors were given all the relevant data they would need to set a price in the market. But then they were exposed to a number that from a completely unreliable source that should have been irrelevant to them. Well, we look at the data and we find that the realtors who were exposed to a higher irrelevant number posted a selling price, an initial selling price higher than those who were exposed to a lower irrelevant number. And I'm not picking on realtors. This works all over the place. Anchoring matters. We anchor and adjust from that first number. So that's a reason why you should. And there's all sorts of psychological principles on your side here too for engaging in an aggressive first offer, which is going to be rejected most times, and then moderating with your counter offer. So we get this high opening meaning first offer, being rejected, and then moderating with your counter offer. Remember, negotiations is a dance. It's back and forth. There are concessions. So if you make a good aggressive first offer, and then it gets turned down, and then you moderate it with a reasonable second offer, there's all sorts of psychological principles in play that help you. I'm not going to go into them in great detail, but let's just suffice to say they all tend to help that second offer look really good in your counterpart's eyes. There's a contrast effect. There's something called the norm of reciprocity, which has to do with these concessions back and forth. And there's the fact that you look more flexible when you moderate with your second offer. All these things help you in negotiations. We know that first offer really matters. It goes with the anchoring. So if part of the equation is in terms of where the outcome is roughly going to be a function of where your first offer is, you want to make it and get it out there and have it be helpful for you. So bottom line, making the first offer can be helpful. And I underline if, because if you know your stuff, you can choose your anchor wisely, but you have to know your stuff. Again, toward that broader theme, prepare, do your homework. You don't just go in there and wing it. So making the first offer can work well if you know your stuff, but there are reasons why you shouldn't. Okay, it's a complicated world. We have two parties dealing with each other. It's a dance, and there's all sorts of adjustments we make to each other. And so there are reasons why you might not want to make it. One is, and I mean, when I say first offer, I'm talking about a reasonably aggressive one. Your counterpart might help you out. They might not know the market as well as you. They might make your life a lot easier by offering something better than you even hoped for. They might come out and make an offer that is just wonderful. So why not let them do that? If your counterpart's not as well schooled as they should be, letting them speak first is a time-honored strategy. And you'll see a lot of that kind of literature if you Google this stuff on the web. Let them throw out the first number. If they don't know what they're talking about, they might not throw out a very good first number. Also, if you decide to throw out the first number and you do not know what you're talking about, you might throw out something a little extreme, and that can offend the other party, and they can walk away. Let's say you don't really know the housing market, but you want to be in my neighborhood, and you hear I'm going to sell my house for sale by owner. So you come knocking at the door, and you say, and then let's say it's a $300,000 house roughly, and you say, hey, Charlie, I'll give you $150,000 for your house. Well, I'm going to slam the door. Well, I'm not going to slam the door in your face because I'm a nice guy, but I'm probably going to politely dismiss you because that's not an offer that tells me you're serious. That's a silly offer. Okay, so if you don't know what you're talking about, you can make an extreme first offer that can lead to people walking away. Or the other side of the continuum, if you don't know what you're talking about, you can anchor poorly and give away too much. Let's say you come to my house, knock on the door, look around and say, Charlie, I give you $350,000. Okay, that works for me. You just made a first offer that's better than I'd hoped to get. So point being, don't make the first offer if you don't know what you're talking about. And if you think maybe your counterpart doesn't know what they're talking about, it's a great time to allow her or him to make the first offer. One more reason here is it may be inappropriate to make the first offer. In certain contexts, like hiring scenarios, it's kind of expected that the employer should make it and not you. Not all the time, but in certain scenarios. And sometimes you're more interested in the relationship than you are in anchoring and making concessions to get a little bit better number. If you're negotiating with your family about how much time to spend together over the holidays, winning is not nearly as important as problem solving. So sometimes when relationships fully surpass any sort of economic and winning consideration. So in that point, first offers to try to take advantage of anchoring and things like that don't likely come into play. Okay, another tactic for you, standards. Remember that standards are sort of those legitimate places in the road or signposts that help define the rules of engagement or indicate where a fair deal could be. And I talked about precedent or comparable home sales. And they also can be processes like splitting the difference. Those can be standards we use as well. But standards can be very tactic oriented. You should think about what your counterpart might want to use as a standard. And if you can frame your arguments within them, your arguments are going to carry more weight. For instance, if you are representing nurses and you are negotiating with a hospital about the number of physicians, number of nurse hires they should have, you probably want to frame your argument in terms of quality patient care. The hospital gets that. You probably wouldn't want to frame it in terms of we need to hire more nurses or we need more money for nurses because that's good for nurses. You want to frame it in terms of what's good for the other side or things that they'll buy into. Similarly, unions might want to frame arguments in terms of productivity rather than this is what the membership really wants. Management understands productivity. If unions can frame the new scheduling proposal in terms of why it might be more productive, it's going to be more likely to carry weight than saying this new scheduling will allow more of our employees to have better home life balance, which may not carry as much weight with the management as productivity. Be able to defend your own standards. You're negotiating for more pay. You want to have pay data that is legitimate and is defensible. By the same token, you may need to argue that your standards are more convincing than the other side's. Be careful in doing that. You just want to make sure you're not insulting them by undermining their standards. Pay is another good example. You may have gotten an outside offer, and that's a pretty good standard. They might be countering with the fact that their internal salary structure suggests you don't deserve much of an increase right now. You might be wanting to argue why the external market factors should outweigh the internal ones, but you want to be careful in making that argument. You don't want to insult them and say that their standards are not worthy. You just want to indicate that your standards are ones that should carry the day in this discussion. Why do standards work? It's again, some interesting psychology behind it all, as there is behind a lot of negotiations. Negotiations broadly tends to be built on psychology and economics as sort of the disciplines that it derives from. We like to appear consistent and reasonable, and so standards make sense to us as we're advancing in these discussions. It also allows us to concede in ways that we can live with. If you come to me with great salary data as to why you deserve an increase, I'm much more likely to buy in and I can sell it to my boss. Well, she had unimpeachable data with an external offer that tells us exactly what she is worth, and that allows me to sell the concession, essentially. We tend to defer to authority in our society, not everybody, but there tends to be a leaning that way, and standards are essentially a form of authority. So we do tend to cite things that are seen as legitimate out there and rational, and defer to them. So these standards can help to shift the zone of agreement, and they do tend to work. So this is really about fostering thoughtful arguments for why your position makes good sense. Okay, some other tactics during a negotiation. Know your BATNA. I'm sorry, during preparation. Again, prepare. Improve your BATNA if you can. You need to think about your reservation price in the cold, emotionless preparation period rather than during the heat of a negotiation. You don't want to ultimately get to a place that you can't afford to go to. Escalation of commitment is one of the terms we use for that, where people end up spending more than they have. Setting a target, goal setting works. We know through decades of research in job performance, in exercise adherence, in weight loss, in all sorts of domains, goal setting works. Set a target for your negotiation. A lot of research shows us that people that set targets in negotiations focus on the targets, they're persistent with regard to their targets, and end up getting deals closer to their targets. If you focus on your reservation price, guess what? That's where you'll end up, close to that. You'd rather end up close to your target. Think about when to reveal your BATNA if it's a strong one. For instance, if you have an outside offer or a second offer in a job, or in purchasing that Monona plant, the Monona plant, we want to bring up that BATNA with Middleton. The stronger your BATNA is, the more it's helpful to use it. You want to use it somewhat early. It conveys legitimacy to your positions. It gives you leverage, and it can save everybody a lot of time. So if you have a strong BATNA, you want to respectfully and professionally get it out there reasonably early. Find standards that make sense. We just talked about that. Think about the first offer, whether or not you know the market well enough, and whether or not you think maybe you would rather let the other person make it and potentially make a mistake. And always think about the other side. Don't just be internally focused. If you know, think about if you're buying Monona and you know the reservation price is 20 million, is that helpful for you? It's extremely helpful for you. It'll help inform you where to make your target. It'll make you more persistent in pushing. It'll help tell you that if they are saying they can't take anything less than 22 million, that they're bluffing, and it'll help you to be more persistent through that. So the degree to which you know your counterpart, it's going to give you more power. Okay, there are other tactics that people use, and you'll see these kinds of lists on if you look on the internet and stuff. I'm not going to go through them all, but there are a whole bunch of other tactics when people are bent on competing that essentially fall into the broad theme of you don't let them find out anything about you, you make them feel pressure, and you find out things about the reservation price. That helps you win, particularly in a zero-sum game where we're just talking about one issue like price. And by the way, I'm not endorsing all of these tactics, particularly the bottom three there, but you should know they exist, and some people have no qualms about using them. People have different ethical standards with regard to negotiations, just like most things in life. We don't all agree on these things, and there are people that feel like lying is just part of the dance, they see it as a poker game. Other people find lying to be in negotiations to be completely unpalatable and not part of the world in which they want to contribute to. So, but it's valuable for you to know that these tactics are out there. These are called distributive bargaining tactics. I introduced that term before. Competitive bargaining is another term for it. And again, this is often in the zero-sum game, one issue kind of approach, but I do want to kind of give you a warning as we move on from that you're not the only one that can read. So while you're doing these kinds of things, these tactics, these gambits that sound kind of cool and tricky, your counterpart may well be doing the same thing. I like to use the metaphor of two boxers and kind of counterpunching. They're both kind of bludgeoning each other with these tactics of bluffing and overstating their position and things like that. But do we have to be going through this where where the counterparts are counterpunching? Is there another way to get to agreement in negotiations? And this can be very effective, particularly if it's a one-issue game about price. But there's a part of life often in negotiations that's about more than one issue. And that raises something called the negotiator's dilemma. Do we compete or collaborate? It's this underlying tension, and it derives from the prisoner's dilemma in game theory, where we talk about strategic behavior. In a single negotiation, there are certainly incentives to be competitive and really rely on those kinds of tactics we talked about before, particularly in competitive situations where it's just a single issue deal like price. And there's a very reasonable incentive to think I should be competitive. I can take advantage of my opponent, or I'm sorry, my counterpart maybe. There's a danger in thinking about them as opponents. But it's just like the prisoner's dilemma, if you recall that from econ when you were here at school. If I'm competitive, it can give me an advantage and it can protect myself. So being competitive makes good sense. But at the same time, just as in the prisoner's dilemma, your counterpart's facing the exact same situation. So you both have incentives to be competitive. And in doing that, you might miss collaborative solutions that can really benefit us in negotiations. This is where we start to move toward the possibility of win-win. These collaborative solutions might allow us to be creative and figure out ways to make the pie, the metaphor of the pie, in other words, this aggregate value to be divided up in a negotiation. It allows us to make the pie bigger. And people like to engage in collaborative negotiations. They tend to feel more satisfied after they're over and more likely to want to do business with their counterparts down the road. So to the extent that we move toward collaborative negotiation, it will be more likely to lead to longer term stable relationships. And that in business as well as in personal lives is generally seen as a good thing. So how do we manage this negotiator's dilemma, this underlying compete, cooperate tension? Most negotiations are not just about price. So we have this term called integrative bargaining or collaborative bargaining. And there are scenarios in which that becomes a more appealing approach. And one of these is when we have more than one issue. So we get beyond just buying a sugar bowl with price or buying a used car with price. And when these issues are asymmetrically important, what do I mean by that? I mean, one issue is more important than the other. And this actually creates a really kind of cool ability for us to create value. And I'm going to walk you through that in a second. But asymmetrically important issues. And when the parties are willing. The parties are willing to engage in problem solving rather than just trying to win. Okay. So realizing that, hey, maybe there's something we can do to help both of us walk away from this with a better deal. This is also can be extremely beneficial for relationships if we can collaborate rather than compete. Okay, so really broadly, there's these two kinds of bargaining, sort of ends of a continuum is one way to think about it. One is competitive, and that's what we kind of laid the foundation for with overstating your position with a strong first offer, allowing you to backtrack. And there are all these other kinds of tactics. I don't have time to go into all the tactics on both sides, but there are tactics that kind of fit in with that competitive approach. And that can work really well, particularly in single issue negotiations. But on the other side of the screen, this collaborative approach, you can see it's an entirely different skill set or set of behaviors. You're talking about what people are really interested in, which sort of underlies their positions, sharing information as opposed to hiding your information, going back and forth with each other, being truthful and respectful and establishing a relationship and trust, and thinking about solving problems. And clearly, the two sides of the screen here are kind of vastly different feels in terms of how we interact with other people. One's about winning and one's about problem solving. So the dilemma here is, yes, there are incentives to be competitive. We're negotiating because we want something, right? But if we're both really competitive, we might miss the opportunity to do some cool stuff with regard to creating value and making a bigger pie and establishing a stable relationship. Now, in reality, even if we do create this cool bigger pie and collaborate and share information and trust, we still have to be competitive enough to make sure that we get enough of the pie. So in actuality, they're both competitive and collaborative aspects, but when we can nudge the needle a little bit more toward the collaborative end of the continuum, that's when we can really have the opportunity to do some cool win-win kind of stuff. But we know it's a negotiation where there's still a competitive aspect. Okay, so last piece here, I think I've got roughly 5 or 6 minutes here to finish up. So the last piece is, well, how might we do this? And I'll kind of be scratching the surface here, but just to give you a notion of how we might move toward this more complex, but potentially more bountiful win-win kind of solution. How do we create that kind of value when we have negotiations that maybe aren't just win-lose about price? A little background, negotiations with different terms. So we're talking about integrative bargaining now, creating value with the notion that if we can do that, there's more pie for both of us, more value to be split up eventually. And relationships might benefit because of it. And the last bullets are important. It's not easy. It's not easy, and we spend a lot of time during the semester working on it, but it's often really worth it. It often really pays off in terms of both value and relationships for long term. So why doesn't everybody do this? If it sounds cool, why doesn't everybody do it? Well, there's some things that are really working against it and make it tough. Partisan perceptions, we tend to see the world from our own through our own lenses, from our own interests, and focus on that as opposed to thinking about what the other side might really want and need quite as much. And that kind of lends toward internal claiming value, competitive approach. We tend to have a fixed pie bias where our default, even seasoned negotiators, the default tends to be to thinking about, here's how much is at stake here, as opposed to, could we do some creative things to make this bigger, to help out and create value for both sides. So there's a fixed pie bias that's sort of inherent in us. And that leads to kind of this default focus on those winning tactics, those competitive tactics, as opposed to the more collaborative ones, like sharing information, establishing trust, and thinking about the interests of the other side. So it really requires a lot of work. So there are challenges to getting there: effort, patience, and trust. Okay. Maybe it's not easy, but how do we get there? There's something called integrative issues. I mentioned this before, asymmetrically important issues. How do we find those? I'm going to talk about how we can exploit them in a second. How do we find them? We know from tons of research, good negotiators ask questions. Ask questions. That's going to, whether you're competitive or collaborative, asking questions, you're going to do better. Sharing information slowly. Sharing information leads to trust. Trust leads to sharing more information. So it's this iterative process. And that understanding where the other side is coming from allows us to be creative and figure things out and solve problems. The other bullet, sometimes offering multiple packages, allows us to kind of hone in on what the other side really values, which can be important. Thinking about interests and oppositions, let me give you a super quick example. Maybe I go to my dean and say, I'd like to be department chair. That's my position. And maybe the dean can't do that for whatever reason. Maybe it's been promised to somebody else. But maybe the dean and I actually talk and share some information, like reasonable people. And the dean finds out what I'm really interested in, what's underlying my position. My position's I want to be department chair, but my interest underneath that is I want to gain some administrative experience. Well, once the dean finds that out, then it broadens our discussion. Maybe we figure out there's another position in the building where I can gain that kind of experience without being department chair. I get a win by really satisfying my interest, which is more administrative experience. The dean gets a win by filling this spot, and it's because we actually shared information and talked and got beneath my position to what I was really interested in. So interests are really important here in integrative bargaining. Again, it's more about problem solving and winning. My last slide here then, how do we leverage these integrative issues? I call them these asymmetrically important issues, which sounds kind of mysterious. It's much more complicated, or it's much less complicated than it sounds really. The deal is you care more about X and your counterpart cares more about Y, X and Y being a couple of issues in the negotiations. If you can trade these things off, you can both end up much better off. And when I say trade them off, I mean, the key here is each side gets a big win and a small loss. Think about it. From your baseline of 0, if you can get a big win and a small loss, you come away better off. You come away happy. If both sides can get big wins and small losses, we have created value for both sides and set up a scenario where both sides tend to leave happy with the situation, or at least satisfied and respecting the other side, and maybe want to deal with them down the future and having a relationship. It's sort of in the abstract. Let me give you a couple of really concrete examples. Okay, let's say that you are a scientist of some sort in your company and you have received an outside offer for a pay increase. You'd really love to get that. You think the external market's talking, you like money, you'd like to get your current employer to at least match that offer. At the same time, you think, since I have a little leverage now with that outside offer, better BATNA, which gives me better leverage, you think, well, maybe now's the time for me to move from the scientific track over to the managerial track. Been thinking about doing that, thought I'd do that in the next 5 years sometime. Maybe now's the time. It's not nearly as important to you as the money in my scenario. You really want to get brought up, you want that offer matched. And yeah, you think maybe I'll make that move now if that's okay. So that latter is a small issue to you. But the big one is you really want to be able to leverage that outside offer to get a pay increase. So you've got a big issue, and issues is not quite as big. Let's say your manager, on the other hand, your manager, she knows that sometimes we have to pay good people more to keep them. That's the cost of doing business, right? We don't tend to want to just throw out money for frivolous reasons, but this is a good reason. So happy to incur a little bit of a loss and spend a little more money to keep you here. On the other hand, the manager maybe is acutely aware that we're running a little low in terms of scientists. We have a small company. We really need your expertise on the science end much more than on the managerial end right now, at least for this year, maybe for the next year or two. So from the manager's perspective, the bigger issue is keeping you as a scientist. The smaller issue is, all right, I may have to pay out a little more money. We prefer to keep our costs low when we can, but the big issue is I really need to keep you as a scientist. So big wins and small losses is what this is all about. If you and your manager talk, share information, kind of figure things out, the way this works in a value creating way is that you get the pay increase that you really, really want, but you stay in the science position. You get the big win and the small loss. Yeah, we'd rather get everything, but life doesn't usually work that way. You get the big win and the small loss. You're reasonably satisfied. You understand where the manager's coming from. You've had a good discussion. You're pretty happy. The manager feels pretty happy too. Big win, keeping you in the science post. That's really, really important. Small loss, have to pay a little more money, but I understand that we have to do that sometimes. Both sides get a big win and a small loss. On balance, feeling like we came out of this better than we started. This is good. We created enough value, we created enough of a pie to divide it up and leave both sides pretty satisfied with where we got to. Let's consider the alternative. You and your manager don't really communicate very well, and it ends up with you getting that other position, the managerial track, and not getting a pay increase. Well, you got the small win and the big loss. Your manager got the small win and the big loss. That's a much smaller pie. That's not where we want to be. If we can share information and establish trust slowly and gradually, and we can work toward the more valuable solution on both sides. That's one example of asymmetrically important issues that have different levels of magnitude and value for both sides. Let me give you a different example. We'll circle back as we wind it up today to the plant where we started. We thought about buying that Monona plant. Okay, let's say that we'll take price out of it, take money out of it. Let's say that a couple issues left on the table as you're finishing up the negotiation for the Monona plant is that, or one of them, is that you really need to take over January 1st. There are all sorts of things in motion with what you produce. It's really, really important you take over January 1st. Folks in Monona, they'd rather get out June 1st of the next year. It's going to be a little more, a little problematic to get out January 1st. They can do it. They'd rather do June 1st, but they could do January 1st. Okay, but it's really important to you. There's another issue in play, sort of a silly one, an odd one from your perspective. They want it written into the contract that the plant itself retains its red color that it has had for the last 75 years while in the family of the people that owned it. These people have had it for 3/4 of a century. They are big Badger supporters. They used to tailgate in front of the plant before every game. They want it to stay red. It means a lot to Grandma and Grandpa. Okay, this is a little annoying to you, but you can live with it. So what happens here for a big win and small loss for both sides? You get the start date that really matters to you. You live with the fact that you have to paint the stupid plant red or keep it painted red. You're not really happy about that, but you get the big win and the small loss. The folks selling it get the big win and the small loss. You both leave thinking, well, they were reasonable to deal with. Maybe down the road you come up with and see each other at some other business interaction, and you remember that these were people I could deal with. Big wins and small losses create value, and they create the impression that these are people I could deal with in the future. So 2 examples of how integrative issues that are asymmetrically important can create value. Big wins, small losses. Okay, with that, what I try to do is lay a little groundwork for you with terminology, give you some applied tactics that you could take away, move on toward a little more nuanced negotiation. We have multiple issues and have to kind of face that compete or cooperate dilemma, and then give you a little bit of a sense of how we can move toward win-win if we can leverage asymmetrically important issues, among other things, and thinking about interests instead of positions. Some references for you that you can look at. I use the top one in my class. It's a really well-written book that weaves together a lot of tremendous stories with the research that's been done. I think it's really a great first stop if you want to think more about negotiations. And the other 3 are terrific as well. Any of these would be really nice for you if you want to kind of pursue this this thinking. With that, thank you very much. I've really enjoyed talking to you. I hope I haven't run over my time too much. And Shannon, I guess I'd turn it back over to you now.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Charlie. I think it was a great presentation, a lot jam-packed into it. So
Yeah.
appreciate it. I want to turn to questions now, and we'll get to as many as we can. Just a reminder to all of our viewers, if you have a question, you can type it into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and let's see how many we can get to. You answered one, Charlie, with your list of resources already about kind of what the go-to texts are. So looks like you had a premonition that might be a question. We have another one about any suggestions that you would have for negotiating with a high conflict person or entity that's not necessarily behaving in a rational business sense. So in this particular question, it sounds like maybe you're already in that transaction and you can't really roll it back without some big consequences that might be really costly. So any suggestions?
Yeah, there are, obviously this can be a difficult situation, and sometimes it just doesn't work. Sometimes you need to walk away when you're dealing with someone who doesn't want to deal reasonably from your perspective. There are things you can try. One approach people sometimes take is to have a surrogate, essentially someone else who, particularly if it's someone else who the other person knows, kind of bringing in that person into the conversation, someone who might sort of be a little bit of a go-between. That's one approach. Another approach is some people are very good at using humor to disarm somebody or to lighten the tension of the situation, depending on the specific context that the question is meant from. So people will sometimes use humor to kind of help get past some of that conflict and tension. Other people are very astute with regard to ascertaining the personalities of the person they're talking to. And sometimes it helps just to apologize and to try to give the person a little bit of space if it's a high conflict person. There's a little bit of danger in that you don't want to necessarily make concessions and reward someone who's being maybe angry or whatever they're being, but there is the notion of sort of making room for that personality. And it can be a very difficult thing. It's called the art and science of negotiation for a reason. Sometimes it's just comes down to how well you read people and figure out what will work with them. And for some people, you have to match strength with strength at some point. It may be that playing the nice, reasonable person doesn't work, and ultimately it may come down to you taking a tougher stand. And we talk about ultimatums and threats in negotiations, and it's a place I rarely advocate going to first, but there are times when it gets to be kind of an end game strategy that's high risk, high return. Sometimes making that ultimatum can pay off, particularly if you're dealing with somebody who you feel like it's just not going to work. So it might be that the high risk, high return potential strategy then is called for. But it can be really, it's one of the toughest things we all wrestle with.
Right.
Yeah.
So good luck to that person who
Yes.
asked that question. Going to our next one here, someone's asking, when applying for jobs, often you are asked in the initial application about your minimal salary target, or sometimes what your current pay is. Should someone be answering that question so early in the process? And if so, do you have recommendations on how to answer that?
Yeah, that's one that we all, everybody sort of hates, that that question, being asked to do that. There are things you can try, and they may or may not work. One is to sort of deflect the question and say that you know, you need to learn more about the position first before you could knowledgeably indicate what you think you should be paid there. Another is to fall on the fairness standard. I talked about standards before, and just say, I just want to be paid what I'm worth. I just want to be paid the industry standard for someone with my skill set and my qualifications. I'm not looking to make anything more than I'm worth. I think once I'm there working for you, I will be able to demonstrate my value. But for right now, I don't want to be paid fairly. Now, it might be sometimes these questions come up in an electronic format. You have to fill it out simply to move to the next page on the screen. So it might be you simply have to fill in a number. And so this also goes to the importance of preparation, doing your homeworks, because if you're forced to put in a number, obviously you don't want to put in a inappropriate one. But I also want to maybe speak to the stress level associated with these kinds of questions a little, and that, remember, the employer is not looking to stick it to you. They have a vested interest in you coming to work for them and being satisfied with all aspects of the employment scenario, including the reward system. So they usually have, and this, you know, changes across companies and across levels as you go over time, but they usually have a pretty good idea of what they should pay somebody of your skill set. And so they know that they bring you in really low and somehow manage to lowball you, that there's a pretty good chance that you're going to be unhappy, and when the market turns and supply and demand turns in your favor, that you'll leave. So they tend to not be wanting to really stick it to you. So don't let yourself get too intimidated by that question. As often it's not going to have the impact that you might fear it's going to have.
Good point of view.
Yep.
So that's all the time we have for today's presentation. So Charlie, I want to thank you for your time, and I want to thank everyone who tuned in for today. As I mentioned at the beginning, today's presentation was recorded, and so we'll share a link to that recording via email in the coming days, along with the survey. We really do appreciate your feedback. So thanks for watching, everyone, and have a great rest of your day on Wisconsin.
Thank you.